Hi, I'm Geoff Tuff. I'm here with my buddy Steve Goldbach. We wrote a book recently called Detonate, and we thought we might take a few minutes today to take you through some of the core principles. So, Steve, you've been a strategist for a long time. You've talked about sources of advantage. What's happening these days with advantage?
Well, long-standing advantages are getting disrupted from new technologies that either make possible business models that are an order of magnitude better quality.
So this is just a book about digital disruption, is it?
No, we're going to get to this. You gotta let me get this out.
Okay.
We're going to talk about an order of magnitude better quality and order of magnitude lower cost, right?
Okay.
And long-standing source of advantages have typically been in three categories. You've got supply advantages, which are things like IP or access to raw materials that have been part of your value proposition, and now you've got the ability for companies to disrupt those long-standing sources of IP. So, for example, nations compete, and the nation of Saudi Arabia has access to more extractable oil than other nations, so they win on supply advantages. You've got demand advantages where you've got customers locked in because they have either high switching costs or high search costs. And you've got scale advantages where you've got the ability to spread a fixed cost over a larger unit of revenue.
So that's the old.
That's the old way.
type.
But when you think about how these things are getting disrupted, think about natural scale advantages. So, for example, in the world of radio, you used to have to spend a lot of money to erect radio towers, and now with a few lines of code, you've basically got radio's business model in Spotify, right, which is cheaper to distribute, so an order of magnitude lower cost, right? And so that's an example. Okay. Think about the world of supply advantages. If you used to want to get a custom-made suit, you'd have to go to a tailor, right? That was your only option. And now with your phone, you can use an app like mTailor to effectively take a 3D image of your body and then upload it, and then they'll send you the same custom-made suit for an order of magnitude lower cost. And so these disruptive technologies are enabling long-standing advantages to be obfuscated. And the problem that we're trying to solve is that the typical response to this is companies try to suck a little bit less. What do I mean by that? Is that Taylor, they try to put an espresso machine in...
Which is a good ad.
Yeah, they try to put an espresso machine in the waiting room. That's what they do, right? What's a good ad?
I mean, it's a good ad to have espressos in the waiting room, but I agree with you. It doesn't lead to a better experience.
Right. It doesn't really change the consumer's algorithm. The algorithm now is: do I really want to spend all that time going to the tailor? Do I really want to spend 3 times getting fitted, 4 times getting fitted, having someone run their hands on my body, getting pricked with a pin, and instead I can do it in my home. It takes me 10 minutes, and then I'm done. So that's a big, long-standing source of advantage that's now disrupted, and you see that in all kinds of things. Like I talked about the radio business, and you see it in habits getting disrupted in demand advantages. So that's the world that we're living in. That companies that have had long-standing sources of advantage are now getting highly disrupted, and they've got to figure out what to do next. So why don't you tell them how their world is changing around them in terms of how they even think about risk versus uncertainty?
No, I'd be happy to. As you might imagine, I have something to say on that, and I know you love it when I do this, but I'm going to have to draw a picture to explain it.
You always have to draw a picture.
Okay.
Yes.
So this actually starts with something that we have historically talked about as the ambition matrix, and it has to do with, originally the ambition matrix was invented to talk about how you think about innovation portfolios. It was a very simple concept that if innovation is the creation of new economic value, you have assets with which you can create that value, and you have people for whom you create the value. And there are basically 3 different dimensions on each of those axes. On the assets dimension, you've got existing assets, you've got incremental additions to those assets, and you've got brand new assets, usually meaning the deployment of new capital. Same 3 things on this side. So if this is your asset base, same 3 things on this side. You've got existing customers, you've got adjacent customers who you may not serve today but have similar needs to your existing ones, and then you've got brand new customers which are not just new to you but new to the world. So when we came up with this idea, as I know you know, Steve, what we said is, and the research that we did suggested that there are really 3 different levels of ambition that any company can have when it comes to innovate. You can innovate in the core, which is about advancing your existing set of products for existing customers. You can innovate in the adjacent space, which is about stretching into new areas using an existing business model or an existing asset of some sort. And then you can innovate in the transformational space, which means deploying new capital to discover things in the world that have never existed before. So we used this originally to try to understand the nature of the best type of innovation portfolio structure, and what we discovered at the time that we did this is that 70%, for the ideal optimized portfolio, 70% of the innovation activity should be in the core, 20% should be in the adjacent space, 10% should be in the transformational space. It was a great article when it came out first 7 years ago, but now, I hate to say it, but it's turning completely irrelevant. And the structure itself is not turning irrelevant, but the numbers are. So what we've been seeing happening over the course of the last really 3 to 4 years is that there has been a massive opportunity migration from these innovations in the core to more transformational innovation.
Right, which ties back to the whole, if your core business is getting disrupted, there's not as much value to being investing in your core.
And so the way that we think about that very simply now, so just imagine you've got the same picture behind us, but there's really 2 different domains of opportunity. You've got opportunity that exists in your core business or the near adjacent space, which we think of as being the known opportunities, meaning you can go out into the market, you can get data, you can ask customers what they're looking for, and they're going to give you pretty decent information. Above the line here is the so-called unknown space, where in far adjacent and transformational innovation, where you cannot go and ask customers what they're looking for because solutions have never existed like that before, there's not real data that you can go and collect. And so ultimately, what we believe is happening is that if you remember the 70-20-10 thing that I covered before, 7 years ago when we wrote that article, 80% of the opportunity, roughly, lay below the line in the known space. It was totally fine to run your business systems, presuming that you could get good data and put it into your risk management models or to make any sort of management decisions. What's happening now, because of the impact of exponential change and exponential technologies, is that 80% is dwindling and reducing to something like 50 or 60% and dropping as we have this massive opportunity migration. And what that means is that we are moving from a world that has historically been all about risk, which is what the known world is, to a world that's increasingly about uncertainty. And the key difference between these things is that risk is measurable and therefore it's manageable. Uncertainty, by definition, is not measurable, and you need to use completely different systems to go and try to deal with uncertainty than you do with risk.
Yeah.
So that's what I have to say on the known unknowns.
Yeah, and then the natural, if you start to combine the two topics, so the world is getting we've got these technological advances, which is driving that world that we're seeing there, the movement from the known to the unknown.
Yep.
And so I guess the question is, how are people and how are organizations responding? And what we're seeing is that organizations are responding because they're very comfortable in that known world. They're increasingly trying to apply the playbooks that they've got in the known world, right, to the unknown world. And that's effectively the problem that we're trying to solve. And what we discovered was that this is really a problem that goes back to the human condition, right? And it's like if you remember the first day that you started on the job, right? You probably sat down with your career advisor and said, how can I be successful in this organization? And they probably said something to you like, if you want to be successful, here are all the things that I did when I was in your shoes. And so you start to think about, you want to enjoy a long career. So you ask what's going to make you successful, and then you understand the playbooks, and then when you're faced with that marginal call, you execute on the playbooks that made you simple and made you successful, and then that was always
that was the recipe for success.
That was a recipe for success. Do what my forebears did, and you too can be successful. And the world wasn't changing fast enough. If stuff wasn't precisely perfect, we could adjust it over time and everything would be fine. The problem is given all the factors that you described with risk versus uncertainty, when we apply tools and techniques from the world of managing risk to tools and techniques that are real, or to opportunities that are about uncertainty, we start to get failure. We start to get system failure. And instead what we're seeing, which is this bizarre, what we've coined as this bit of a vicious cycle, where you put out a move or a business model into the world, and all of a sudden consumers don't like it, right? It fails. And
it's not just consumers, right? It's almost any sort of management move. It doesn't have to be just in the market.
No. It could be a management move. It could be any sort of business choice that's ground in the world of the past. And so what ends up happening is the thing fails, and then the boss comes in and says, "Well, did you do exactly what I told you to do?"
Did you follow the playbook?
Did you follow the playbook exactly? And then they start to do all the predictable things with the world of the known. They examine all the data. They analyze it further. They try to understand what went wrong in their risk models, and so they put it back into the marketplace. And then lo and behold, it fails again. And as soon as we see the pattern continuing, where now someone more senior comes in and someone more senior come in, and all of a sudden you're going down towards a world where you're Blockbuster Video and you're competing and you're defining your business model as we're in the store business, not the DVD to home business or the content business. And what we find really odd is that the more failure that you have, the problem is not that we start to question the playbooks. The problem is that we believe the playbooks are right. We don't question them at all.
It's the application that must have gone wrong.
Right. It's not the strategy's not right. We must have executed it wrong. Right. It's all those silly executions. And so that ends up being the vicious cycle that we're trying to blow up. And what we wanted to write about, as is what is it that you can blow up in order to enable success in the future. So why don't you tell us about your favorite?
My favorite playbook. And so if I had to summarize what you just said and relate it back to the picture I drew before, it sounds like the issue is that the playbooks that may have worked well in the past, that made us successful in our careers, that used to work in the world governed by risk, are suddenly going haywire in the world governed by uncertainty, which I think makes good sense. So my favorite, as Steve said, these are not Steve Goldbach, Steve Goldbach's initials, Steve Goldbach system failure, but StageGate system failure. So StageGate is one of my favorite playbooks to focus on because it actually, as a concept, makes good intuitive sense when it's applied to the world of risk. Yeah. So for anyone that's looking at this that has not run into a StageGate process before, which would frankly be surprising, it's a concept that's been around for decades. And the basic notion behind StageGate opportunity development systems, or StageGate-like risk management systems, is that you have multiple different stages of development of, let's call it a new product that's going to market, multiple different stages of development, and then gate reviews after each stage, at which point a group comes together, usually senior executives comes together, they look at the progress that was made in the stage of work that happened just previously, and they consider the investment rationale to continue on with this opportunity development. And usually the way that they consider the investment rationale is they look at a financial model and they consider what the cost is to develop the opportunity, they consider what the likelihood of success is, and they either say, yes, go ahead, move on to the next stage. So you may go from early stage ideation to early stage prototype development, however you've set up your stage gate system. And so they say either, yes, go ahead to the next stage of development, or no, we're killing this project, or let's actually recycle it. Go back to the previous stage, get better information, get better data, and we can make it.
And the whole thing looks kind of like a big funnel, right?
Yeah, basically. And the way stage gates are typically drawn is a funnel on its side. That's exactly right. So as I say, most companies have completely over-engineered their stage gate systems, but they generally make good sense when you can put good data into the models. And so if you're going to a gate review and you actually have real known information that you've been able to collect from the market and put it into the models, you may be making some slight hypotheses here and there, but it's generally probably a good tool to help make a decision.
And that's the key, right? It's the quality of that, it's the validity of that data going in, as opposed to there's lots of data. The question is, does it actually does it actually mimic what might happen in the world?
Right, and in the known world, it usually does, more or less. But the problem is when you take something like StageGate from the known world and you put it into the unknown, where, going back to our definition, you cannot collect good data, one of two things ends up happening. Either people literally make up the data to go into the model, and it doesn't say, it sounds ill-intentioned, but actually most of the time it's labeled a hypothesis, so we'll go back and test at some point, but we never actually go back and
It's
test
a spreadsheet assumption.
Right, exactly. So they make up the data because the objective function has now become to pass the gate review as opposed to making a good decision. Or what they do is they take something that may have been really interesting and able to advance the company in that unknown realm and pull it closer and closer and closer to what they know so that they can put good data into the model and look like they've done the right thing and followed the playbook. And so if you think about what that hypothetical team set out to do to create real new value by entering into that unknown space, the direction that the whole world is going, and what ends up happening on account of applying a StageGate system, they essentially fundamentally wiped out any sort of advantage they could have created for the company by following that playbook. But back to your point about the vicious cycle, it's a self-protecting mechanism for them to follow the playbooks in order to make these decisions.
Because they want to avoid looking stupid in a meeting. They want to effectively. No, that's StageGate is certainly one where you can see the folly of the past process. My favorite one, as you know, is the all too familiar financial forecast, right? And this is the one where this is the playbook where we say it's October. It's time to start forecasting what we're gonna do for the next 3 to 5 years from a financial point of view. And
that's why calendars exist, right?
Exactly, because it's October. It must be. We better get all those meetings in our calendar to make sure that we've got time for the financial forecast, which will update again in at the start of the next fiscal. But how do all financial forecasts start? Almost always.
Revenue.
Right. You always start with like how much revenue are we going to make over the next 5 years, or even start with like how much is our market going to grow by, right? How much is the market that we're in going to grow by? And as we know from the world of what you said about known versus unknown, we're already assuming that's by asking the question that way that we know exactly what the market's going to grow like over the next 5 years, and then we ask a very insidious question, which is, and what will our share be of that market? And that helps derive our revenue.
Which I have to say, I mean, it sounds, I know it's easy for us to look at it and think it's completely ridiculous, but in a world that isn't changing that much, where you're kind of experiencing linear change, it kind of makes sense you take some lessons from the past to do your projections.
Right. The challenge is when you start to apply it, you say the problem will be that the world just simply isn't working in that way, nor has it actually ever worked that way. The world hasn't yet revealed until now that was not a very good method. But if you start to think about it, so you get to your revenue forecast, and then you ask your second question, which is how much money do we want to make? So what's going to be our bottom line? What's going to be the profit that we earn? And then you ask the worst question of all, which is how much can we afford to spend to make the money we want to make?
Make money we want to make, and make the money we need to make because our shareholders.
Right, because we've committed to targets in the street or for the street or what have you, and the unfortunate thing is that's the logic that's applied to most financial forecasts. But when you think about does the world work in that way, it's like no, the world works in literally the opposite way. We start with costs, we spend money to do things that are valuable for our customers in the real world, and then they reward our business with revenue, and then the leftovers are our profits, as opposed to we plan for profits and the world is kind enough to be predictable enough for our revenue. And so all of our financial systems are geared towards this predictability, and rather, I think we should be planning around the behavior that we want to change, the stuff that we want to see in the real world, and understanding how much it's going to cost in order to achieve that behavior. And unfortunately, we're so geared towards trying to put a number in the size of the envelope that we need that is so predictable, we can't help but notice that we're going to be wrong more often than we're not. And our systems are just geared around things like that. And that's the kind of thing I think we need we need to be changing.
Yeah, that obviously, as you might imagine, makes sense to me, and
I'd be surprised if it didn't.
yeah, it'd be sad if it didn't make sense to me. So obviously we in the book we go through the so-called 7 deadly playbooks, which I think we readily admit are not deadly for everyone, and everyone probably has their own deadly playbooks, but things like risk management systems, financial forecasting, strategic planning, adhering to a calendar,
career paths,
org charts, and without going into
syndicated
detail.
data.
Why didn't we come up with more playbooks instead? Like, we wrote this book about blowing up the playbook. Shouldn't we have actually suggested some new playbooks for people?
Well, it would be tremendously inauthentic if we said,
and ridiculous.
You don't want, your playbooks are bad. Now here are the right playbooks that will last forever. That's sort of not quite the right way to think about it, don't you?
So we didn't do that, and instead, I think what we did is we said, look, there are no one's going to change their company overnight, but what you do need to do is instill a different mindset, and there were 4 key principles that we identified in the course of our research, 2 having to do with thinking differently, which Wes and I cover those, and you can talk about acting differently.
It's good that we wrote those on the board before.
Yes, to remind ourselves what the book is about. And so on the thinking differently side of the ledger, the one that I feel most passionately about, and that I think is at the heart of any sort of systemic change to get rid of old playbooks, is the notion that in everything you do, focus on human behavior. And what I mean by that, and I think what you mean by that, is if you think about what the average company is these days, still and forever, I don't care how digital you become, the most basic economic unit of analysis is still human behavior. And so the way I think about that very simply is, if you've got a performance curve, okay, think about a revenue line or a cost line or whatever, and you look at steady state, whether it's projection or from the past, that performance curve does not change, good, bad, or anywhere in between, unless someone somewhere changes their behavior.
Yep.
And I don't here just mean customers like in the market. I mean, it can be customers, it can be employees, it can be regulators, it can be suppliers, it can be partners, but someone somewhere has to change their behavior in order for a performance curve to change.
And when you think about it, this is the root of all the classic failures that we see in the world, where they say, well, why didn't the M&A go right, or why didn't my culture change when I had my culture change program, or why didn't some other market entry work? It's usually because someone didn't do the thing that people just assume that they do. So what we're basically saying is, you have to name the thing that you want to be different.
Yeah, and the 201 or 301 version of that, beyond naming the behavior you're trying to change, is to understand through your entire business system, what is the accumulation of human behaviors that create economic value for you? Okay, so from the beginning of your value chain to the end, who are the human beings involved? And then ideally say, if we were to shift one behavior versus another, or you look at the entire system, which one has disproportionate value for us if we can drive that behavioral change? Imagine if what we did as people within businesses was to spend our time saying, what are the human behaviors we're trying to drive, and then focusing our resources on actually achieving that behavioral change. That would lead to a completely different way of doing business, and probably almost automatically blow up the playbooks that have previously been used. So the second think differently principle is actually in the subtitle of our book, and it's about bringing a beginner's mind. And what we mean by that, it's a well talked about and well-known concept at this point, stolen from the world of Zen Buddhism, and I'm going to butcher the quote yet again, so you can make fun of me when I butcher it, but our favorite quote about that comes from Suzuki's book, Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, and it's something like, in the beginner's mind, there are many options. In the expert's mind, there are few.
I think he says possibilities. So just officially get the quote. Okay. There are many possibilities.
In the expert's mind, there are few. And so, but I think what we're trying to say in borrowing that phrase in Detonate is to say, there used to be a time when the type of advantage existed that you had talked about, whether it's scale, demand, or supply advantage. There used to be a point in time where expertise really mattered. Because ultimately the purpose under any of those models is you were trying to drive efficiency with your scale, and one of the ways you drove efficiency is to find people who had been there, done that, or lived through that experience before, and have them bring their expertise to the table in order to make a decision. But what ends up happening naturally when you bring expertise to the table is you narrow the aperture in terms of the possibilities or the possible solutions you could bring. Whereas if you bring a beginner to the table and you say, go and try to do this, imagine the average startup entrepreneur, digital disruptor, he or she, when they come to a challenge at hand, don't say, well, geez, how do I go and execute on this using my entire legacy business system and all the playbooks that I've got to go and implement? No, they say, how would I do this more? How would I do this better? How would I better achieve the behavioral change that I'm going after? So that's what we mean by bringing.
And if you go back to the chart that you drew up here, you kind of go, okay, this is for expertise.
Yep.
And this is where the beginner. That's where the beginner's mind comes into value, because you can't if it's unknown, then you got to be testing more possibilities, and that's the key there.
So that's thinking differently.
Right, and then if you think differently, you've got to actually be willing to act. You got to be willing to act differently, and this is where companies, I think, because they've got the ingrained systems like the stage gate system and the forecasting system that are, have been repeated for so long, and they've developed these habits. They need to start to break the habits by thinking about how do they act differently. And we've talked about the thing that they need to do the most is characterize their moves as minimal viable moves. Mm-hmm. And we took that from the world of product design, which often starts with minimal viable products, and extended it to almost any business decision that you can make, and say, how could you decide to do something in a manner that would be just the smallest increment that you could go in to learn a little bit about the human behaviors that you're trying to cause, to see if you're causing those behaviors or not. So
and to do it super quickly.
To do it super quickly, super cheaply, to the extent that you can, and learn about the behaviors. So particularly if you're in that uncertain world, the thing you want to do is figure out to what extent you can change the behavior that you need to change. How much will it cost? Whether you can do it. So you're going out and constantly testing. And we think you can live in a world of consistently trying to make minimal viable moves. And we often talk about the story that I experienced when I was at Forbes magazine, where we wanted to corner the market on the QCAT. And the QCAT, remember, was a device that you could scan a barcode, and it would take you to on a print advertising page. It would take you to a web page. And we thought we were going to be bold by sending out a million QCATs to all of our subscribers.
And it must have taken a while to find the million that you wanted to send to, and do product development.
Well, they were kind enough to have subscriptions with the magazine, so we were able to find them. The issue was the cost of mailing it to them, the cost of the device. So it was a good chunk of money. And what it turned out was that it's not, it wasn't rocket science. The hypothesis was a good one, that we wanted to know, could we create more value for advertisers by creating more engagement? The problem was this was the world of 2000, and the QCAT was a wired device, and you had to use it while you were plugged into your desktop computer, right? And as it turns out, the human behavior is people don't always read their Forbes magazine sitting in front of their desktop. They like to read it, say, on a plane or on a train or on the subway. And maybe it might have been different if the QCAT was a wireless device, but it wasn't. And so it turned out our hypothesis was wrong. We couldn't change the behavior. Now, it doesn't mean that was not worth testing. It just means we didn't need to send it to a million people.
Probably could have sent it to 100
or
and got the same.
30, and just to watch what they were doing and figured it out. And so
it sounds like the opposite of the old world we were living in, which is all about analysis and making sure you collect the data and make measured decisions. That we're saying essentially, put that aside. Don't get rid of it completely, because you're still going to have some opportunities in the known world where data is going to work. But these minimally viable moves are all about the world where you acknowledge the data is not good. Let's not spend time analyzing things.
Right.
Let's just go try it.
Right. Exactly. Let's go try it. Let's get out there in the real world. And effectively, when we say that, I think we should clarify, when we say that data is no good, we mean the historical, all the syndicated data that exists in the world. And what we want to do is create new data by going out and giving our customers something to respond to in the real world.
Yep.
Right. And you're fond of saying, that one of the things that you would like to eradicate is the celebration of that failure. And that's a perfect example of why we don't want to celebrate failure. Is the failure is that we spent too much money, not that we learned something in the real world.
Yeah, the whole notion that we should be celebrating failure, and this is probably a conversation for another time, is actually ridiculous. If you've waited too long to make a move, so much that you've exposed yourself to undue either financial or reputational risk, that's not something you should celebrate.
Right. And so the last principle, if the third one is making minimal viable moves, the fourth one is embracing impermanence, and that just simply means if you make a move today, you can't be so wedded to it that you won't be willing to blow it up, in some period of time later. When if the world is moving really fast, it's not likely to last forever. And the thing that we like to talk about embracing impermanence is the silliness that we often see around career paths, right? Where we bring people into organizations and they ask questions like, well, where will I be in 15 years if I stay here? And it's like, well, first of all, we've got to assume that all of our assumptions about what kind of organization we are today are going to be valid. And then we've got to assume that you're going to be able to predictably go through these steps. And that's just no longer a relevant conversation. So we should be.
But it used to be. I mean, let's say when companies were around for 60, 70, 80, 100 years, it made sense that you could somewhat predictably plan what your career was going to be.
Right. And this is just now not, we have to all be willing to embrace the fact that we don't know what might happen, and therefore we should be focused more on the things that are working today and what we can learn about the future. Let me ask you a question maybe to finish up, Geoff. What would be the advice that you give to people who want to start to apply some of these, over the next while or after they finish this video?
So I'd say probably the first thing to do, especially if you're in any sort of position of authority, and that includes simply someone months into their job, whether maybe a team leader, is ask different questions, ask better questions. Don't ask questions about the return on investment of some sort of move and ask people to go do analysis. Ask about the return on behavior.
Are you saying that we shouldn't care about financials, though?
No. We should care about financials, but to your point about how you set up your forecast, financials should be based on observable outcomes in the market. So if I were to ask you as my underling, this is a fun little thought experiment to do.
Especially
can you please go figure out what would be the return of driving this behavior in the market? Go figure out what it would be, what it would look like for us financially if you were able to drive that behavior versus that behavior, and then build our forecast about that. I bet you'd see significant change throughout the entire system.
You'd understand how much it would cost. You understand, can we get the prices? It would be a different conversation.
Yeah, that's mine. What's yours?
I mean, I just think you got to pick something and try it. I mean, this is where don't overanalyze it. Try, like when you're faced with a problem, whatever your next problem is that you're working on, instead of deciding that you're going to go study something more, go figure out how you could design a test, right? How you could design something to go try it out in the real world. I think we're spending way more time today trying to learn about something before we make a choice, and instead try to figure out that way to convert it into let's decide today and see how it responds, because I think that's the best way to study something.
Funny thing is, a lot, as I listen to you, especially on that last one, it sounds like a lot of these ideas, a lot of the whole notion that we should challenge the way that we've always done things could apply equally well outside of work as it does to the workplace.
I agree.
All right.
I agree.
Let's go blow some stuff up.
Indeed.
All right, thanks.
Nice
Steve.
talking to you.
All right, good talking to you.
All right.